Today on No Greater Love with Pastor Jeff Kramer.
We got Jacob's son, Judah, right here, deceiving Jacob himself, Genesis 37, right? This is where he took the Joseph's coat of many colors. They put the animal blood on it, and they sent it back. Hey, identify, is this your son's coat? And all that stuff. And now here in Genesis 38, Judah deceives Tamar, right? Because he never intended to give his youngest son, even though that's what he told her. And then we have Tamar in this final episode that we just read, deceiving Judah. The consequences of deception, that this was flowing down and spilling through from Jacob, and it just continued to move down through his whole family. Here's the point, don't miss it. If we don't put to death the deeds of our flesh, we will continue to experience the pitfalls of the flesh.
Through innocent blood, he showed his love. Taking the cross for us, no greater love than innocent blood.
Welcome to No Greater Love with Pastor Jeff Kramer. Our study in Genesis picks up today with the story of Joseph. Throughout his life, we see a man who endured great difficulty and pain, even though he had a heart to follow and obey God. Whether it was being rejected by his brothers because of envy and jealousy, and having his family torn apart when they sold him into slavery, or being falsely accused by his boss's wife and getting thrown into prison because of it. Joseph always had the encouraging reminder that God was with him. Even in the midst of darkness and the depths of despair, he always trusted in the sovereign hand of God, knowing his love would never fail. At the end of his life, Joseph could confidently make the bold declaration to those who hurt him, "You intended to hurt me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." And now, here's Pastor Jeff as we continue our study through Genesis.
Now, if you're single, you're not married, or you can't have children or anything like that, please don't move beyond what we're talking about in this chapter. Just understand that we don't want to avoid God's protection. And God has given us his word, and he speaks to things about the marriage. Now, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, from Israel to the church, we know that God, he speaks in his word about intermarrying. And I need to bring this up because we're seeing this firsthand in chapter 38 and what is going to spill out from this, and even the amazing redemption ultimately that happens in the New Testament. But for now, let's take a look at this. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, take a look at the screen here. Paul gave this. You know, he was asked from those in Corinth, he was asked a question. He's asking or answering questions rather from those that were single by way of death, right? You know, their spouse had died. He's asking the question to those that are single by way of divorce. And he's going on down through a number of things in the chapter. And we get to verse number 39. And he says, "A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she's at liberty to be married to whom she wishes." And the key phrase is, we see the heart of God carry over Old Testament, Old Covenant, into the New Testament right here. Only in the Lord. In other words, Christians are to marry Christians, okay? That's the general practice. Now, if we were to move on and we were to hold that thought here, and I'll amplify in a minute, and we were to move into 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 2 verses here. Take a peek at this. 2 Corinthians says, Paul also speaking here, he says, "Don't team up with those who are unbelievers. How can righteousness be a partner with wickedness? How can light live with darkness? What harmony can there be between Christ and the devil? How can a believer be a partner with an unbeliever?" And so the magnification of the heart of God from the Old Testament through the New Testament, you know, is that we find that he doesn't want us to intermarry. And I want us to take this something seriously, because I know that the church, big picture as the church within America, has gotten away from touching on these sensitive topics because of how much broken families and broken marriages and split marriages and all that stuff that we have. Well, listen, first century Christianity was no different to the pain that you and I are experiencing right now. And so while it's important for those of you that are not actively married to understand what God has for you as a Christian, it's equally important here for those of you that are already married, for those of you that are in a split marriage. Maybe that has been because you have come to faith. Maybe it was because of a choice that you made a long time ago. Regardless of whatever that choice is or how that has come to be, I want you to walk away with hope in God and understanding that God will sustain you, and for the Christian spouse, if your wife is not saved or your husband is not saved, please understand that you are a massive agent to the balance of your home, and God is still with you. And so when we touch on these topics like this, I don't want you to get that knee-jerk reaction where you flinch and you coil up and you push back. I want you to understand that you're to stay on mission. And let me show you what that looks like here. We'll take a look at the screen here on a few verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there's a little bit of magnification in there. Paul says, now I will speak to the rest of you. Though I do not have a direct command from the Lord, he says, if a fellow believer has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to continue living with him, he must not leave her. Can we understand that? Very simple, right? We get that. Okay, let's move on to the next one. I think there's a couple verses here on this. He says, and if a believing woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. Pretty understandable. Would you agree? Yes. Let's move on. He says, for the believing wife brings holiness to her marriage, and the believing husband brings holiness to his marriage. Otherwise, your children would not be holy, but now they are holy. He says, but if the husband or wife who isn't a believer insist on leaving, this could be the hard part right here, let them go. In such cases, the believing husband or wife is no longer bound to the other, for God has called you to live in peace. And these are some powerful truths. And I know the impact on any fellowship that this has within our families even. You know, as we step outside of the church, our families are impacted by these truths. And the big idea that we're pulling out of this only by way of application, because we're looking at what Judah did. Judah, you know, he got involved in human trafficking his younger brother. Then he bolts the family, leaves the area. He heads south and west about 20 miles roughly. And in that spot there he gets in and he ends up marrying a Canaanite woman at Adullam, that place of hiding. So he's running from the responsibilities that were there. There are some commentators that say that really that Judah, because of what the previous brothers have done, they disqualified themselves from being the firstborn. And some say that he was even going to be taking the helm of that spot. And so he ran. And when we run from God's protection, bad things happen in our life. We continue to find those difficulties that are there. And so as the story continues here, what goes on? Well, Judah got involved to help his son get married. But God was not pleased with her. Was the oldest son here, as we just read. He wasn't pleased with that son because he was a wicked man. There's no two ways about this. I mean, God calls it out. He says, this dude, he says, why? And what ended up happening? He took the guy's life early, okay? And, you know, do you want to come to a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night and talk about, you know, God taking life early? Probably not. But we should understand some of the things that are going on behind this. Let's move to the next brother here before we dive into this. The next brother, Onan. Now, this guy, he was obligated under the Levirate law of marriage to take his brother's wife and to provide offspring in his name. Now, is really fascinating with this. And if you'd like to turn there in your Bible, and/or we could follow along on the screen here in a moment. But in Deuteronomy chapter 25, Moses later, he lays down some specific things from God, just regarding the heart of God and what this looks like. And so, again, if you're there, awesome. If not, they can flash these things on the screen here for you. And I'm gonna flip ahead to it because I want to give you NLT on this and not just New King James. And so here's what it says in NLT. Again, Deuteronomy 25. Picking up in verse number 5. It says that if two brothers are living together on the same property, put this together in your mind, okay? If two brothers are living together on the same property, and one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to another one from outside the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. This is the Levirate law. It says the first son that she bears to him will be considered the son of the dead brother, so that his name will not be forgotten in Israel. But if the man refuses to marry his brother's widow, she must go to the town gate and say to the elders assembled there that my husband brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He refuses to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law by marrying me. The elders of the town will then summon him and talk with him. If he still refuses and says, I don't want to marry her, the widow must walk over to him in the presence of the elders, pull off his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. We got some drama, mama. Then she must declare, this is what happens to a man who refuses to provide his brother with children. Ever afterward, in Israel, his family will be referred to as the family of the man whose sandal was pulled off. Now, that's a bad deal right there. You don't want to be referred to as the guy who lost his sandal and got spit in the face in the whole 9 yards there. But if we can understand this, okay, we can go back farther before this in capturing the heart of God in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, that God makes provisions in there. It's like, hey, listen, you can't have sex with your brother-in-law, okay? That's in there. Now watch, here's the difference between the two, because why is God saying this over here? You can't have, and then over here he's saying, hey, go and fulfill this particular thing. Listen, this is all about living and dead, okay? So in Leviticus 20, okay, it's adultery. You can't go over there and have sex with somebody else's spouse, okay? We can understand that. But in the days of antiquity here, what we're looking at, and especially in the Middle East in the way that property transferred. Remember, NLT defined this very specially as that, like, hey, two brothers, they're both married, they're living on the same property and all of this stuff. And maintaining those family property rights and sustaining the life of a woman, food, clothing, shelter, and even in this case, sexual intimacy and all that stuff for the continuation of the brother's name. It was okay in God's plan. This is it. This is how God laid this out. Now, we can't get involved in those TV shows that are out there now where you find that, the craziest stuff happens over here in, I think it's the state Utah. I could be wrong with that. I need to be sensitive here. But you see these TV programs where, some dude's got all these multiple wives and kind of trying to go back to something else. Well, what's that called? Starts with a P. That's the one right there. You guys are well versed in that. And so that's not what the Bible's endorsing here, okay? We can understand that, right? Deception, sex, lie, all of it. This is this chapter, man. This is what's in it. Absolutely crazy. And so as we flip back to our core text here, Genesis 38, as we come back to that, we understand this, that Onan, what did he do? Well, he repeatedly took sexual pleasure from his brother's wife, she was a widow. But what did he do? He avoided the responsibility of giving offspring to her. And I read you the text in terms of what it said and what he did. And for this, because this is what he was doing, that God looked on this. He said, no, this is absolutely wicked. And what did he do to that guy? He took his life too. He took, prematurely, he took that guy's life. Now watch, church, okay? Because that's what we're reading here out of Genesis. Now watch here as we come here to our time, okay? Because we're not going to be dealing with the same scene here. But the crazy thing is that we still see this in Scripture, in the New Testament Scripture, of these types of things happening. And now, immediately, you should be doing this in your chair. What? Are you kidding me? Really? Yep. Notice and remember what we were looking at. That when they continue to tempt God, in Old Testament, Israel, or in the New Testament, as Christians, part of the church, knowingly and intentionally sinning against God, God has something to say about that. Let's take a look at the screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Look at this. Follow along with me and just remember this, okay? You're not a stranger to these verses, by the way. He says, for if you eat the bread or drink the cup, what is he talking about right here? Communion, right? Can we understand that? Okay? Without honoring the body of Christ, okay, you're eating and drinking God's judgment upon yourself. Next verse. And notice this. It's the same exact thing in what we just got done reading in the Old Testament. That is why many of you, 3 conditions, weak, sick, and some have even not so enthusiastic about that one. I see that. But I want to make sure that you don't walk away with any type of confusion. Because we're dealing with the same God, Old Testament and New Testament. Yes, we are under the grace of God. But apparently, according to what Paul has written about the communion table and about intentionally, knowingly and intentionally continuing, watch, to live in a place of rebellion, refusing to follow through with what God has said, that apparently that God will have enough of enough, and he moves it to the place. And Paul said right there, he's speaking to the church about the church, that some were weak, some were sick, and some even have died because they've put themselves in that spot. How does God do that? I don't know. Bible doesn't tell us. I'm not elaborating. But here's what I am given to us. It is another lesson for us to understand that if we find ourselves in that place, knowingly and intentionally living in rebellion to God, it is not a good idea. We should reconsider our steps. Can we understand that without being legalistic, heavy, and weird? Yes. All right. So now we have grown in understanding that God means what he says, and it is for us to follow along with what he has to say. Now, we come to the second and the final idea of our night here, and that is, idea number 2, consequences of deception. Now, let me read to you verses, gosh, do I want to read all those verses too? Yep, I do, so we can finish the story. I'm going to read you verses 11 through 26, and let's see how this goes. It says, then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, he says, go back to your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry you. Now notice what it says next. But Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his 2 brothers. So Tamar, she went back to live in her father's home. And some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, they went up to Timnah. Now, remember, I showed you guys the map earlier. So the progression of what was going on, okay? Judah bolted. He took off from the rest of the family. He goes on down here to Adullam, and then, he gets married, and he starts having kids, and he moves around. Okay, now Judah's wife has died. The 2 sons have died. There's one younger son, and the daughter-in-law, who's a widow now, she's there, okay? Now, he didn't fulfill what he was supposed to do for her. And so what happened? Verse 12 again, he says, some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, they went up to Timnah to supervise the shearing of his sheep. You saw how beautiful the area is there in that valley. And someone told Tamar, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. Now, Tamar was aware that Shelah had grown up, but no arrangements had been made for her to come and to marry him. And so she changed out of her widow's clothing, and she covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. And then she sat beside the road at the entrance to the village of En-Naim, which is on the road to Timnah. Now Judah noticed her and thought she was a prostitute since she had covered her face. And so he stopped and he propositioned her. Let me have sex with you. He's pretty straightforward about that. He said, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. Well, she responds, how much will you pay me to have sex with me? Tamar asked that question. Now let's stop and look at me for just a second. If you're doing family devotions with children that are in elementary school, I'm going to recommend some chapters of the Bible for you. It just won't be these chapters right here, okay? You're just going to do it. This is why we're teaching you the Bible this way. You're just arcing over the scriptures in certain spots. If you have teenagers, they may ask you some powerful questions like, okay, mom, dad, what is this all about? Listen, here's a crazy thing about the Bible. God just calls it out as it is. He's not making excuses for all of this stuff. And whether you have had a past in this, okay, now I'm hoping in this moment, I'm speaking to Christians about a Christian walk, okay? So if in your past that you have wrestled with this, either before Christ or maybe even in Christ, okay, let's leave those things in the past. Here's a pro tip right here. This is a pro-marriage tip, if I can say that. For those of you that have been married more than once, or for those of you that had, maybe had, a handful of girlfriends or a handful of boyfriends or however that worked out for your life there, one of the things that you don't want to do in your marriage is compare to the previous person. That's a really bad deal to do. And yet it's a common pitfall that I often see happen even today for those that have maybe not even been married so long. Is that they would reference the other spouse in some sort of a positive way inside the framework of that new marriage. Listen, that new bride or your existing bride, whoever that is. Listen, that is the one, that husband, that woman, whatever. That's the one that you speak to. You don't go back into these areas of comparison. And let me tell you, there is one way to decapitate a person emotionally. It's doing it that way, is referencing back to somebody else. Now, in this particular case here, this story that we're looking at right here is, again, this is what took place. And she stepped forward and she did something, but he was already doing something, and one doesn't justify the other. The Bible is just telling us as it is. And the crazy part about this whole thing is that yet in the middle of the lineage of Jesus Christ, we have Tamar, we have Judah, we have Perez. We have Ruth too, don't we? Oh my goodness gracious, all of the stuff that we see that is carried on. Goes on down, it says this in verse number 17. He says, I'll send you a young goat from my flock, Judah, promise. But what will you give me to guarantee that you will send the goat, she asked. Well, what kind of a guarantee do you want, he replied. And she answered, leave me your identification seal and his cord and the walking stick that you are carrying. So Judah gave them to her, and then he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. Afterwards, she went back home. She took off her veil and put on her widow's clothing as usual. Well, later, Judah asked his friend Hira, the Adullamite, to take the young goat to the woman and to pick up the things that he had given her as his guarantee. But Hira, he couldn't find her. And so he asked the men who lived there, where can I find the shrine prostitute who was sitting beside the road at the entrance of Enaim? We've never had a shrine prostitute here, they said. And so Hira, he returned to Judah and he told him, he says, I couldn't find her anywhere. And the men of the village claimed that they've never had a shrine prostitute there. Then let her keep the things that I gave her, Judah said. He said, I sent the young goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her. We'd be the laughing stock of the village if we went back again to look for her. Now, about 3 months later, Judah was told that Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute. And now, because of this, she's pregnant. Now here's what he says. Here's what Judah says. Bring her out and let her be burned. I mean, gee, what? Come on, man. Now remember where she's living. She's back at her father and her mother's house. Verse 25, it says, but as they were taking her out to kill her, that she sent the message to her father-in-law, the man who owns these things has made me pregnant. Look closely. Whose seal and cord and walking stick are these? And then Judah recognized them immediately and said, she is more righteous than I am, because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son Shelah. And Judah never slept with Tamar again. We'll stop right there. Did you get that? Did you get the fullness of that story? All the color, all the drama, all the stuff in there that we look upon and we go, oh my gosh, it's just so repulsive in all of these things. It's like, But if we go back through the chorus of the scriptures here, we look back on the stuff that we've already gone through here. And we start talking about Jacob, right? Who Jacob's name was changed from Jacob to what? Israel, that's correct. And this is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel coming from Jacob. But as we remember, we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 27. What took place there? We have Jacob deceiving his dad, Isaac, pretending to be his brother. We have Jacob, then he goes forward, and what happens? He's deceived by Laban, his father-in-law, who in Genesis 29, he does that switcheroony. Oh, you want this one? I'll give you that one. Now work 7 more years, and I'll give you the other one too, right? So all that happens. And then we got Jacob's son, Judah, right here, deceiving Jacob himself, Genesis 37. Right, this is where he took the Joseph's coat of many colors. They put the animal blood on it, and they sent it back. Hey, identify, is this your son's coat, and all that stuff. And now here in Genesis 38, Judah deceives Tamar, right, because he never intended to give his youngest son, even though that's what he told her. And then we have Tamar in this final episode that we just read, deceiving Judah. The consequences of deception, that this was flowing down and spilling through from Jacob, and it just continued to move down through his whole family. Here's the point, don't miss it. If we don't put to death the deeds of our flesh, we will continue to experience the pitfalls of the flesh.
He showed his love to us.
That's all for today. Join us for our next broadcast of No Greater Love with Pastor Jeff Kramer, weekdays at 10:30 a.m. No Greater Love is an outreach ministry of Westminster Calvary and is supported by listeners like you. If you would like to partner with us, please text any dollar amount
to 84321. We would like to personally invite you to join us for our weekly worship services Sundays at 8 or 10 a.m. and Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. We are located in Westminster, Colorado on the northeast corner of Church Ranch and Wadsworth Parkway, near the Vasa Fitness. If you're not local, tune into the weekly live stream on our web campus, app, Roku, or on Apple TV. Have you downloaded the free Westminster Calvary app yet? You can stay up to date on coming events, join a small group, request prayer, and watch live worship services. Just search Westminster Calvary on your favorite app store today. Lastly, we're a church that's ready to serve you. If we can do so, give us a call at 303-223-4640. And remember, there's no greater love than when Jesus gave up his life for you and me. Thanks, and God bless.
Taking the cross.